The sound of rushing water was deafening, a continuous roar that seemed to drown out the world. Thompson Creek, usually a calm and serene waterway, had transformed into a furious torrent. Spring's arrival had brought with it the rapid thaw of mountain snow, sending torrents of icy water rushing downstream. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying wood, mingling with the cold, damp mist that hovered over the scene. Alex Jensen, a seasoned biologist with years of experience in studying wildlife, stood at the edge of the creek. His boots sank slightly into the mud as he surveyed the chaotic scene unfolding before him. He wasn't here by chance. This remote part of the forest was his research territory, a haven of biodiversity that he had spent years documenting. Yet in all his time working in the wild, he had never witnessed a moment quite like this. Amidst the swirling, frothing chaos of the water, a grizzly bear stood out starkly against the backdrop of nature's raw power. She was massive, her fur dark and matted with moisture. Even from a distance, Alex could see the tension in her body, the urgency in every movement. This was no ordinary sighting. This was a mother grizzly in distress. Her deep, guttural roars echoed above the roar of the water, a haunting sound of desperation that carried through the air and settled like a weight on Alex's chest. His trained eyes quickly located the source of her anguish. Not far from where she stood, two small grizzly cubs clung to a precarious pile of debris, a chaotic collection of broken logs, branches, and other detritus swept downstream by the current. The debris was caught in the center of the creek, held temporarily in place by an unseen tangle of rocks or roots beneath the surface. The cubs, no more than a few months old, were stranded there, their small bodies trembling visibly even from where Alex stood. They huddled together, their claws gripping desperately at the slippery wood, their high-pitched cries barely audible above the raging water. The mother grizzly paced back and forth on the bank closest to her cubs, her massive paws sinking into the soft, wet ground with every step. Her movements were jerky and uncertain, a stark contrast to the usual grace and power Alex knew bears possessed. Each time she neared the water, the sheer force of the current seemed to push her back, forcing her to retreat to safer ground. Yet she did not give up. Again and again, she approached the edge, her muscles taut and ready, her eyes fixed on her cubs with an intensity that spoke of her singular focus, saving them. The water around the debris was relentless. It surged and swirled, battering the logs and branches with merciless force. Alex could see the way the pile shifted slightly with each powerful wave, the logs groaning under the pressure. The cubs' tiny claws scrabbled for purchase, slipping occasionally on the wet wood, and each slip sent a fresh jolt of panic through Alex. He could feel his pulse quicken, his own body tense, as if he were the one trying to hold on against the impossible odds. Time seemed to slow as Alex watched the scene. He had encountered grizzly bears countless times before, had studied their habits and behavior in meticulous detail. He knew their strength, their resilience, their capacity for both ferocity and tenderness. But this was different. This wasn't a textbook observation or a research note to be jotted down. This was raw, unfiltered life and death playing out before his eyes. The mother bear let out another roar, louder and more forceful than the last. She stood at the very edge of the water now, her claws digging into the ground as if anchoring herself against the pull of the current. Her head swung from side to side as she scanned the creek, her instincts battling against the reality of the situation. She knew, Alex could see it in the way she moved, that the water was rising. The debris wouldn't hold much longer. Alex glanced upstream, where the creek curved sharply between two rocky outcrops. The meltwater rushing down from the mountain seemed endless, a relentless surge that fed into the creek's already swollen body. The logs and branches that had been carried downstream earlier were larger now, heavier, more forceful. Each new piece that hit the pile, where the cubs clung, seemed to destabilize it further, shaking it to its very core. It was only a matter of time before it all came apart. Alex's hands clenched at his sides. He could feel the dampness of sweat on his palms despite the cold air. His mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. He was here to observe, not intervene. That was the rule. But standing there, watching the scene unfold, it felt impossible to stay still. The mother bear's desperation was palpable, a living, breathing force that seemed to reach out and grab him by the throat. He knew the risks, knew that even the slightest attempt to approach the scene could result in disaster. For himself, for the bears, for everyone involved. The cubs cried out again, their high-pitched wails cutting through the noise of the water. Alex's gaze snapped back to them, his heart hammering in his chest. The smaller of the two was struggling, its tiny limbs shaking as it tried to hold on. The larger cub pressed against it, as if trying to shield its sibling from the relentless spray of the water. Alex felt a pang of helplessness, an ache that settled deep in his gut. There was nothing he could do. Nothing. The mother bear seemed to feel the same helplessness. She roared again, her voice raw with emotion. She stepped into the water, just enough for the current to lap at her paws, and Alex could see her muscles bunching as she tested the strength of the flow. It was too strong, too fast. She pulled back, shaking the water from her fur with a violent twist of her body. But she didn't retreat far. Her eyes never left her cubs, her focus as unyielding as the current itself. The scene stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. The water continued to rise, creeping ever closer to the top of the debris pile. The logs groaned under the strain, shifting slightly with each new surge. Alex could see the strain in the mother bear's every movement, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She couldn't wait much longer. Neither could her cubs. And yet, there was no clear path forward. No solution. Only the relentless march of time and the cold, unforgiving reality of nature. The roar of Thompson Creek's rushing waters filled the air, a relentless reminder of the danger unfolding before Alex Jensen. The biologist stood rooted to the muddy bank, his eyes locked on the mother grizzly and her two cubs stranded on the debris pile in the middle of the raging torrent. The logs groaned under the pressure of the current, and the mother bear's desperate roars sliced through the sound of the water, creating a symphony of chaos that seemed to hold the world hostage. As Alex stood there, frozen between his training and his instincts, the screech of truck tires broke through the cacophony. He turned, startled, to see an old pickup bouncing along the narrow dirt road that ran parallel to the creek. The truck slid to a halt on the wet gravel, and out stepped Joe Martinez, a local fisherman known for his deep connection to these woods. Joe was a man of the river, his tan skin weathered by years spent under the sun, his hands calloused from hauling nets and fixing boats. His wide-brimmed hat was tilted at an angle, dripping water from the misty spray that hung over the creek. He approached with quick, determined strides, his eyes scanning the scene. "What's going on here, Alex?" Joe's voice carried above the roar of the water. He gestured toward the grizzly and her cubs. "Looks like you've got yourself a hell of a problem." Alex exhaled sharply, relieved but wary. "Joe, they're trapped. The mother's trying to save them, but the current," he broke off, shaking his head. "It's too strong, and the debris won't hold much longer." Joe squinted at the scene, his sharp eyes assessing the situation. He didn't need Alex to explain further. Years of fishing these waters had taught him to read the river like a book. The way the current pulled and twisted around the debris told him all he needed to know. Time was running out. Without a word, Joe turned and jogged back to his truck. Alex followed, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and apprehension. Joe reached into the bed of the truck and pulled out an inflatable boat, its bright orange surface standing out starkly against the gray-green of the forest. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Joe asked, his tone calm, but edged with determination. Alex hesitated. "Joe, that's a mother grizzly out there. If we get too close..." "We don't have a choice." Joe cut him off, his voice firm. "Those cubs won't make it, and neither will she if she tries to go in after them. You in, or are you just going to stand there?" Alex swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew the risks. The fury of a protective mother bear, the unforgiving current, the fragile stability of the debris. But he also knew that if they didn't act, the outcome was certain. With a nod, he made his choice. "I'm in." Joe grunted in approval and got to work. The two men moved quickly, unrolling the inflatable boat and attaching a small motor. The air was thick with tension as they prepared, every second feeling like an eternity. Alex could hear the mother bear's roars behind him, a constant reminder of the urgency. He glanced over his shoulder to see her pacing even more frantically now, her massive body tensed and quivering with fear. The cubs' cries had grown weaker, and the debris beneath them shifted ominously with each surge of the current. Joe tossed Alex a life jacket. "Put this on, and whatever happens, keep your head. You panic out there, and it's over for all of us." Alex nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he fastened the straps. He wasn't a stranger to danger. Fieldwork often came with its fair share of close calls, but this was different. This wasn't a controlled environment, a calculated risk. This was raw, unfiltered peril, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. With the boat inflated and ready, Joe pushed it to the water's edge. The current grabbed at it immediately, tugging it with a force that made Alex's stomach clench. He climbed in first, his boots slick on the wet surface, followed by Joe, who took the controls of the motor. The small engine sputtered to life, its hum almost swallowed by the roar of the creek. As they eased into the water, the world seemed to shrink around them. The forest, the sky, even the sound of the rushing water, all of it faded into the background. There was only the boat, the river, and the bears. The current was brutal, jerking the boat sideways as Joe fought to keep it on course. The spray from the water was icy cold, drenching them both within seconds. Alex gripped the sides of the boat tightly, his knuckles white as he tried to steady himself. Every muscle in his body was coiled with tension, his heart hammering in his chest. "Hang on," Joe shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He maneuvered the boat with precision, steering them closer to the debris. The logs were larger and more treacherous up close, their jagged edges a stark reminder of the danger. The mother bear watched their approach, her dark eyes flicking between the boat and her cubs. Her roars had stopped, replaced by a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of Alex's neck stand on end. "She's not happy," Alex muttered, his voice tight with fear. "She'll be less happy if we screw this up," Joe shot back, his focus unwavering. The boat drew closer to the debris, the motor straining against the current. Alex's hands trembled as he reached for the paddle, ready to steady the boat against the shifting logs. The cubs were just feet away now, their small bodies huddled together as they clung to the unstable pile. One of them let out a pitiful cry, its voice weak and hoarse. "Easy now," Joe said, his tone low and steady. "We got one shot at this." The boat rocked violently as a wave slammed into them, spraying water over the side. Alex nearly lost his grip, his breath catching in his throat as the boat lurched toward the debris. He reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing against the rough surface of a log. The cubs flinched at the movement, their eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, the mother bear let out a deafening roar, her massive frame lunging toward the water. Alex's blood ran cold as he saw her claws dig into the bank, her muscles rippling with tension. She was ready to charge. "Hold on," Joe shouted. The boat tipped dangerously, the current threatening to overturn them. Alex gritted his teeth, his body straining as he fought to keep the boat steady. The tension was unbearable, every second stretching into an eternity as they hovered on the edge of disaster. And then, with one final surge of effort, the scene reached its breaking point. The inflatable boat rocked precariously as Joe Martinez gripped the motor's handle, his weathered hands steady despite the chaos surrounding them. The roar of the rushing current seemed louder than ever, a deafening reminder of the stakes. Alex Jensen sat at the bow, his eyes fixed on the debris pile ahead where the two grizzly cubs clung desperately, their tiny bodies trembling against the relentless force of nature. Every muscle in Alex's body was tense, his knuckles white as he clutched the paddle, ready to steady the boat if needed. The mother grizzly was still on the shore, pacing along the bank, her massive frame visibly quivering with tension. Her dark, intelligent eyes never left the boat, watching every move the men made. Her low, guttural growl reverberated through the air, a constant reminder that any wrong step could spell disaster. Though she hadn't charged, Alex and Joe both knew the danger was real. The bear's instincts told her to protect her cubs at all costs, and if she perceived the men as a threat, there would be no hesitation. "Keep it steady, Joe," Alex shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the creek. "I'm trying," Joe barked back, his focus razor-sharp as he fought to keep the boat on course. The current tugged at them mercilessly, pulling the boat sideways and threatening to tip them into the icy water. Every adjustment Joe made with the motor felt like a battle against the river itself, the small engine whining in protest. The boat was now only a few feet from the debris pile, and the true scale of the challenge became clear. The logs and branches were slick with water, their jagged edges shifting and grinding against one another as the current pushed and pulled at them. The cubs huddled together near the center of the pile, their cries weak but persistent. One of them slipped slightly, its claws scrabbling for purchase, and Alex's heart jumped into his throat. "Joe, we're running out of time," he yelled, his voice laced with urgency. Joe didn't respond, his jaw clenched tight as he maneuvered the boat closer. The logs groaned ominously as the boat nudged against the edge of the debris pile, and Alex felt a fresh surge of anxiety. He could see the terror in the cubs' eyes now, their tiny bodies shivering from cold and fear. They were so close, and yet the danger felt insurmountable. "Grab the paddle and hold us steady," Joe ordered, his voice cutting through the noise. Alex didn't hesitate. He plunged the paddle into the water, using it to brace the boat against the current. His arms strained with the effort, every muscle burning as he fought to keep the boat in position. The cold spray from the creek soaked through his clothes, chilling him to the bone, but he didn't dare let go. Joe moved carefully, shifting his weight to the side of the boat as he reached out toward the cubs. The larger of the two cubs flinched at the movement, its eyes wide with fear, and let out a pitiful whine. Joe froze, his hand hovering just inches from the cub. "Easy, little one," he murmured, his tone surprisingly gentle. "We're here to help." The mother bear let out a sharp bark from the shore, her body tensing as she saw Joe's hand reach toward her cub. Alex glanced over his shoulder, his heart pounding. The bear's posture was stiff, her ears pinned back, but she didn't move closer. She was watching, waiting, as if trying to understand their intentions. Joe extended his hand again, slower this time, and the larger cub seemed to calm slightly. It blinked up at him, its tiny chest heaving with rapid breaths. With a deft movement, Joe scooped the cub into his arms, cradling it against his chest. The cub let out a surprised squeak, but didn't struggle. "Got one?" Joe called out, his voice tinged with relief. Alex nodded, his grip on the paddle tightening as he braced the boat against the shifting debris. The logs beneath them groaned again, and he could feel the pile starting to break apart. They didn't have long. "The other one's still there," Alex said, his voice tight. "Hurry!" Joe set the first cub down gently in the boat, wrapping part of a tarp around its trembling body to keep it secure. Then he turned back to the second cub, which was even smaller and more fragile-looking than its sibling. This one was clinging to a particularly unstable section of the debris, its tiny claws dug into the slippery wood. The water surged around it, splashing over its back, and it let out a feeble cry. Joe leaned forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The boat rocked dangerously as he shifted his weight, and Alex's breath caught in his throat. He planted the paddle firmly against a submerged rock, using it as a brace to steady them. "You've got this," Alex said, more to himself than to Joe. Joe reached out, his fingers just brushing the cub's wet fur. The little bear flinched and let out a panicked squeal, its claws slipping slightly on the log. Joe lunged forward, grabbing the cub by the scruff of its neck just as the log beneath it shifted violently. The entire debris pile shuddered, and Alex felt the boat lurch as the currents surged against them. "Pull back!" Alex shouted, his voice hoarse. Joe yanked the cub into the boat, his grip firm but gentle. The little bear squirmed in his hands, its cries sharp and frantic, but it didn't fight him. Joe wrapped it in the tarp alongside its sibling, securing them both as best he could. "Go, go, go!" Alex yelled, his voice filled with urgency. Joe didn't need to be told twice. He revved the motor, the engine straining as he steered them away from the collapsing debris. The current fought them every inch of the way, pushing the boat sideways and threatening to overturn them. Alex kept the paddle planted firmly in the water, using it to guide them back toward the shore. The mother bear's growl rose in pitch as the boat drew closer to land. She was pacing more frantically now, her massive frame towering over the edge of the creek. Alex's heart hammered in his chest as they neared her, every instinct screaming at him to be cautious. As soon as the boat touched the shallows, Joe cut the motor and grabbed the first cub. He climbed out of the boat slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The mother bear stopped pacing, her body rigid as she watched him approach. Her growls softened into a low rumble, her ears swiveling forward as she took a tentative step closer. Joe set the cub down gently on the muddy bank and backed away. The little bear scrambled toward its mother, letting out a pitiful whine as it pressed against her massive legs. The mother bear lowered her head, nuzzling the cub briefly before turning her gaze back to the boat. Joe returned for the second cub, repeating the process with the same careful precision. The mother bear didn't move, her dark eyes locked on him as he placed the second cub beside its sibling. Both cubs huddled against her, their tiny bodies trembling but safe. Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The tension in the air was palpable, but the mother bear didn't show any signs of aggression. Instead, she stood there for a long moment, her eyes scanning the two men as if assessing them. Then, with a low huff, she turned and began to lead her cubs away from the water, disappearing into the dense forest. Joe slumped back against the boat, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Alex joined him, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. "Hell of a day," Joe muttered, his voice tinged with exhaustion. Alex could only nod, the weight of what they had just accomplished settling over him like a heavy blanket. The danger was over, but the memory of it would linger for a long time. The forest fell into a strange silence, broken only by the muted roar of the creek behind them. The adrenaline coursing through Alex Jensen's veins was finally beginning to subside, leaving an almost suffocating exhaustion in its wake. His legs trembled as he stepped out of the inflatable boat, his boots sinking slightly into the muddy bank. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, mingled with the sharp tang of cold water. Joe Martinez remained motionless beside the boat, his chest rising and falling heavily as he caught his breath. The man who had just navigated one of the most treacherous waters Alex had ever seen now seemed utterly drained, his weathered hands still clutching the edge of the boat. The sheer weight of what they had just accomplished hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Not far away, the mother grizzly stood on the shore, her massive frame silhouetted against the dark green backdrop of the forest. Her cubs huddled close against her legs, their tiny bodies trembling but safe. The larger of the two cubs let out a small, weak cry, nuzzling against its mother's fur as though seeking reassurance. The smaller cub, still wrapped in the tarp Joe had used to shield it, struggled to free itself, its claws snagging on the fabric. With a gentle motion, the mother bear reached down and nosed the tarp aside, freeing her cub and pulling it close. Alex froze as he watched her. The bear's every movement was deliberate, her immense power restrained by a tenderness that caught him off guard. There was no more roaring, no pacing, no frantic growls. The tension that had gripped her massive body during the rescue seemed to melt away as she nudged her cubs closer, enveloping them in the safety of her presence. Yet, something about the scene made Alex's throat tighten. He had seen bears countless times in his years as a biologist, studied them, documented their behavior, but never had he witnessed something like this. The rawness of the moment, the fragile balance between survival and connection, left him humbled in a way he hadn't anticipated. Joe shifted beside him, muttering under his breath. "Never thought I'd see the day a bear like her would stand so still after all that." Alex nodded silently, his eyes never leaving the bear. It wasn't fear that kept him frozen, but something else, something deeper. The mother grizzly wasn't moving away. Instead, she stood there, her gaze fixed firmly on the two men who had just risked their lives to save her cubs. It was an unnerving sight. Her eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto Alex's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. He had always known bears to be creatures of instinct, ruled by survival and the raw laws of nature. But in that moment, there was something in her gaze that felt almost human. "She's looking at us," Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. Joe let out a soft chuckle, though it lacked humor. "You're telling me that's not something I'd expect to see in a million years." The bear's gaze shifted to Joe, her massive head tilting slightly to the side as though studying him. The cubs whimpered softly at her feet, their tiny forms pressing closer to her legs. For a moment, time seemed to stretch and slow, the world narrowing down to just the two men and the bear. Alex felt the weight of her eyes, the depth of her expression, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she understood what they had done. It wasn't a look of aggression, nor one of fear. It wasn't the wild, instinctual glare of a predator sizing up a threat. No, this was something different, something Alex couldn't quite put into words. It was as though the mother bear was acknowledging them, recognizing their actions, their intentions. "She knows," Alex murmured, his voice trembling slightly. "Joe, I think she knows." Joe remained silent this time, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. He was a man of action, someone who had spent his life working with his hands, solving problems with grit and determination. Yet, even he couldn't deny the weight of the moment. The mother bear took a step forward, her massive paw sinking into the soft mud with a squelch. Alex's heart leapt into his throat, his muscles instinctively tensing. But she didn't charge. She didn't growl or show any sign of aggression. Instead, she simply stood there, her eyes flicking between Alex and Joe. Her breathing was slow and deliberate, her massive chest rising and falling with an almost rhythmic calm. Then, with a low huff that sent a cloud of mist into the cold air, she lowered her head slightly. It was a subtle motion, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make Alex's breath catch. He didn't know why, but the gesture felt significant, like a silent acknowledgement, a moment of connection that transcended the barriers between species. Did she just... Alex couldn't finish the sentence, the words catching in his throat. Joe swallowed hard, his voice low and gruff. "Don't say it, kid. You'll make me think I'm losing my mind." The bear straightened slowly, her gaze lingering on them for just a moment longer. Then, with a deliberate grace that seemed almost surreal after the chaos of the rescue, she turned and began to move away. Her cubs followed closely at her heels, their small, clumsy steps a stark contrast to her powerful, fluid movements. Alex and Joe watched in silence as the trio disappeared into the dense undergrowth. The forest swallowed them quickly, the shadows closing in behind them like a curtain. And just like that, they were gone. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The roar of the creek seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the quiet hum of the forest. Alex let out a shaky breath, his chest feeling tight and hollow at the same time. His clothes were still soaked, his body chilled to the bone, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was the look in the bear's eyes, the unspoken message that had passed between them. "Well," Joe said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was gruff, but there was a softness to it that Alex hadn't heard before. "That's one for the books." Alex nodded, unable to find the words to respond. His mind was still replaying the moment, the intensity of the bear's gaze, the subtle dip of her head. He didn't know what to make of it, didn't know if he even could. All he knew was that it had left an indelible mark on him, a reminder of something he couldn't quite name. Joe clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "Come on, kid. Let's get out of here before we freeze to death." Alex managed a faint smile, the corners of his mouth twitching as he turned to follow Joe back to the truck. The inflatable boat bobbed gently in the shallow water, its bright orange surface streaked with mud and debris. It was a small, battered thing, but it had done its job, just like they had. As they packed up their gear and prepared to leave, Alex cast one last glance at the forest where the bears had disappeared. The trees stood silent and still, their dark forms blending into the shadows. But in his mind, he could still see her, standing there on the bank, her eyes filled with something that felt almost like gratitude. And for the first time in his career, Alex Jensen felt truly humbled by the wild. The rescue at Thompson Creek became more than just a fleeting encounter between man and nature. In the days that followed, the event spread like wildfire across the region. Park rangers, wildlife experts, and even local officials were captivated by the story of a mother grizzly bear and the two men who risked everything to save her cubs. But for Alex Jensen and Joe Martinez, it wasn't just a story. It was a wake-up call. Alex sat in the cramped office of the Thompson Valley Wildlife Station, staring at the report he had spent the last few days writing. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the desk, his mind replaying the harrowing events of the rescue over and over again. The dull hum of the overhead fluorescent light only added to his exhaustion, but he couldn't let it go. Something about what had happened out there felt bigger than just a single rescue. It was a reminder of how unprepared they truly were for moments like this. Across the desk, Joe sat slouched in a chair, his wide-brimmed hat resting on one knee. His arms were crossed, and his face wore the same expression it always did. Tough, weathered, but with a flicker of something deeper, something unspoken. The old fisherman had been surprisingly quiet since the rescue, and Alex wasn't sure if it was fatigue or something else. "Park's never going to be the same after this," Joe muttered finally, breaking the silence. His voice was low, rough, and carried the weight of everything they had experienced. Alex looked up from his report. "What do you mean?" Joe scoffed softly, shaking his head. "You think this is just going to blow over? People are going to start asking questions, Jensen. Why didn't we have the equipment we needed? Why didn't we have a team ready to respond? Hell, why was a fisherman and a biologist the ones out there risking their necks instead of park rangers?" Alex didn't respond right away. He knew Joe was right. The rescue had highlighted glaring gaps in the park's ability to respond to emergencies involving wildlife. They had been lucky. Lucky that Joe had his boat. Lucky that the mother bear hadn't attacked. Lucky that they had made it out alive. But luck wasn't a plan, and Alex knew it couldn't be relied on next time. "I've been thinking about that," Alex said finally, leaning back in his chair. "We need to do better, Joe. If this happens again, and it will, we can't afford to be unprepared." Joe raised an eyebrow. "You got a plan? Or are you just going to keep talking?" Alex smirked faintly, though his exhaustion dulled the humor. "Both." The first changes came faster than Alex had expected. Word of the rescue had reached the park's administration within hours, and soon after, the Regional Wildlife Board got involved. The story had struck a chord with the public, especially once photos of the mother grizzly and her cubs made their way into local newspapers and online articles. People were fascinated by the tale of human intervention and the apparent gratitude of the bear. But beneath the surface, the story revealed the cracks in the park's infrastructure. Alex found himself thrust into the spotlight, not just as a biologist, but as an advocate for change. He spent hours meeting with park officials, wildlife experts, and community leaders, sharing his insights and pushing for new approaches to wildlife rescue. Joe, though less vocal, was right there beside him, his gruff demeanor lending an air of no-nonsense practicality to their arguments. "The first thing we need is better equipment," Alex said during one particularly tense meeting with the park director. The man, a stoic figure named Raymond Carter, sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable as Alex laid out his proposal. An inflatable boat shouldn't have to come from a local fisherman in an emergency. The park needs its own rescue equipment. Boats, ropes, harnesses, everything. Carter leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "You're asking for a significant investment, Jensen. Where's the guarantee that this kind of situation will happen again?" Joe, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, fixing Carter with a hard stare. "You want a guarantee? Here's one. Nature doesn't give a damn about your budget. You think this was a one-time thing? Bears, elk, mountain lions, they're all out there, and they don't wait for you to be ready. You want to sit here and hope nothing happens again, or you want to actually do your damn job?" The room went silent. Alex glanced at Joe, surprised but grateful for his bluntness. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line, but after a long pause, he nodded. "Fine," he said. "Put together a list of what you need, and I'll see what we can do." With Carter's reluctant approval, Alex and Joe got to work. They collaborated with other biologists, rangers, and even rescue professionals to create a comprehensive plan for handling wildlife emergencies. It wasn't just about equipment. It was about training, preparation, and understanding animal behavior. Alex spearheaded the creation of new training programs for park staff, focusing on the nuances of working with distressed animals. He emphasized the importance of reading body language, understanding instincts, and knowing when to act and when to step back. The goal wasn't just to save animals, but to do so safely, without putting humans or wildlife at unnecessary risk. Joe, meanwhile, took charge of the practical side. He worked with local suppliers to procure equipment, often haggling fiercely to get the best deals. He even volunteered to run hands-on training sessions, teaching rangers how to navigate the river's treacherous currents. His no-nonsense approach won over even the most skeptical staff members, and soon, the park had a fully equipped and trained rescue team. As the months passed, the changes began to take shape. New equipment arrived, including inflatable boats, rescue harnesses, and specialized gear for handling large animals. Rangers attended regular training sessions, honing their skills and learning from both Alex and Joe. The park also implemented a rapid response system, ensuring that help could be mobilized quickly in the event of an emergency. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Visitors to the park felt reassured knowing that steps were being taken to protect both wildlife and people. Donations poured in from conservation groups and local supporters, helping to fund the new initiatives. For Alex and Joe, it was a vindication of their efforts, a sign that their work was making a difference. But for Alex, the biggest reward came not from the accolades or the changes, but from the memory of that moment on the riverbank. He often found himself replaying the scene in his mind. The mother grizzly standing still, her eyes locked on his, her head dipping slightly in what he could only describe as gratitude. It was a moment that had changed him, reshaped his understanding of the bond between humans and the wild. Joe, of course, had his own way of processing it. "You know," he said one evening as they sat by the creek, watching the water flow calmly under the fading light, "I still think that Bear knew exactly what we were doing. Don't care what anyone says. It wasn't just instinct." Alex smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "Yeah, Joe, I think you're right." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in shadows, the two men sat in silence. Their work far from finished, but their bond to the wild stronger than ever. The story of the Thompson Creek rescue didn't fade as time passed. Instead, it grew. It became something larger than Alex Jensen or Joe Martinez, larger than the park or even the grizzly bear and her cubs. It became a symbol, a tale whispered in classrooms, shared around campfires, and discussed in conservation circles around the country. The mother bear, her cubs, and the two men who risked everything to save them became the beating heart of a movement, one that would change lives far beyond the boundaries of Thompson Valley. For Alex, the aftermath of the rescue was overwhelming. His name became synonymous with the event, his face appearing in articles, interviews, and even a documentary about the relationship between humans and wildlife. At first, the attention felt suffocating. He wasn't the kind of person who sought fame. He was a biologist, not a hero. But as he saw how the story inspired others, he began to understand its importance. "I never expected it to matter so much to so many people," Alex admitted one evening as he and Joe sat by the creek, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold. The water flowed gently now, its fury long gone, but the memories of that day remained vivid. Joe leaned back against a rock, his wide-brimmed hat tilted low over his face. "That's because you're thinking like a scientist," he said gruffly. "But people don't care about data and charts. They care about stories. And this one? It's a damn good story." Alex smiled faintly, though he still felt a pang of discomfort at being the center of attention. For Joe, the fame was less intrusive. As a local, he was already a well-known figure, and the rescue only solidified his reputation as a man of action. But even Joe wasn't immune to the impact the story had on the community. The small town near the park became a hub of activity, drawing visitors who wanted to see the place where the rescue had taken place. Tourists flocked to the creek, standing on its banks and imagining the scene as it had unfolded. The roaring water, the stranded cubs, the mother bear pacing in desperation. Local businesses benefited from the influx, with shops selling shirts, mugs, and postcards adorned with images of the grizzly family. But it wasn't just about tourism. The story ignited a passion for wildlife conservation among the locals. Children who had never paid much attention to the wilderness around them suddenly found themselves fascinated by the idea of helping animals. Schools organized trips to the park, where students listened to rangers talk about the rescue and the importance of respecting nature. For one 12-year-old girl, named Maria Torres, the story was life-changing. She had always loved animals, but her dreams of becoming a biologist had seemed impossible in their small town. Her parents worked long hours and resources were limited. But when she heard about Alex Jensen and his work, something clicked. She began spending hours at the local library, reading every book she could find about wildlife. She even wrote a letter to Alex, pouring her heart into every word. Alex received the letter on a cold winter morning, his breath fogging in the chill as he opened the envelope. The handwriting was messy, the words spilling across the page with an energy that reminded him of himself at that age. By the time he finished reading, his chest felt tight with emotion. "Dear Mr. Jensen," it began, "my name is Maria, and I'm 12 years old. I heard about what you did for the bear and her cubs, and I want to do that too someday. I love animals, but I don't know how to help them. Can you tell me what I should study? I promise I'll work hard. Thank you for being brave." Alex sat back in his chair, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. He had given lectures before, written papers, even mentored interns, but this was different. This wasn't about science. It was about hope. He wrote back immediately, sending Maria a list of books to read and resources to explore. He also included a personal note, encouraging her to never give up on her dreams, no matter how far away they seemed. Over the years, Maria's letters became a constant in his life, each one a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place. The mother bear and her cubs also became symbols within the park itself. Rangers and visitors often spoke about the moment when the bear had seemingly paused to thank her rescuers. That single gesture, a dip of her head, a moment of connection, took on a life of its own, becoming a story that transcended species and bridged the gap between humans and the wild. The park administration leaned into the momentum, launching a new initiative called the Grizzly Trust Program. The program focused on fostering better understanding and respect for wildlife, combining education with hands-on conservation efforts. Guided tours emphasized the balance between observing animals and keeping a safe distance, while workshops taught visitors how to minimize their impact on the environment. Joe, ever the practical man, played a key role in the program's development. He ran sessions on river safety, teaching rangers and volunteers how to navigate treacherous waters without endangering themselves or the animals they sought to protect. His gruff manner and sharp wit made him a favorite among trainees, who often left his sessions with both practical knowledge and a renewed respect for the wilderness. Rule number 1, Joe would bark during his training sessions. "You're not the hero here. The animals are. Your job is to keep them alive, not to make yourself look good. Got it?" The trainees would nod, some nervously, others with determination. And though Joe rarely showed it, he took pride in seeing the next generation step up, ready to carry the torch. Years later, the impact of the Thompson Creek rescue could still be felt. Maria Torres grew up to become a biologist, working alongside Alex in the very park that had inspired her dreams. Together, they continued to push for better conservation practices, always striving to honor the legacy of that day. The mother bear and her cubs, though never seen again, remained a powerful symbol. Visitors often left small tokens by the creek, a stone carved with a paw print, a handwritten note thanking the bear for her trust. The park became a sanctuary not just for animals, but for people seeking connection, inspiration, and hope. For Alex and Joe, the rescue was a turning point in their lives. It had forced them to confront their own fears, to push beyond their limits, and to see the world through new eyes. And though the spotlight eventually dimmed, the bonds they had forged with each other, with the park, and with the Grizzly family remained unbreakable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alex and Joe stood by Thompson Creek once more. The water flowed gently now, its surface catching the light in a way that made it seem alive. "Think she remembers us?" Alex asked, his voice soft. Joe snorted. "She's probably out there somewhere, telling her cubs about the time two fools in a boat came splashing through a creek." Alex chuckled, the sound warm and unguarded. "I like to think she does." And as the forest whispered around them, the creek carrying their voices into the wild, they both knew that the Grizzlies' legacy would live on, not just in the park, but in the hearts of everyone it had touched.